The lighthouse had not shone a light in 3 years, and Mara Coyne knew it the moment she came down the last stony mile of the coast road and saw the tower standing dark against a sky the color of wet slate. She had walked 11 miles that day, with the wind pushing at her from the waterside, and her boots had let in the sea early on, so that each step now came with the small, cold complaint of soaked wool. In her hand she carried a leather case no larger than a hymnal, worn pale at the corners, and inside it lay the one thing she had not sold to bury her father and pay the debts he left behind: a set of navigator's instruments, a brass sextant and a folded chart, and a book of tables in a hand. Who had once plotted the passage of ships from a chair by a window because no company would let a woman stand a watch? Mara had learned it at that chair. She had learned it so well that it lived in her fingers, and yet in the town of Scarrow, where she had spent her last coin on bread that was 3 days stale, no one had asked her a single question. She had not. What she had was a name a fisherman had given her, half in pity and half to be rid of her, the name of a man who kept the light out past the point and who had lost his keeper's helper to the mainland the winter before. Cassius Wren, the man was called, and the fisherman had said it the way people said the names of difficult horses. He is not unkind, the man had said, only he has run out of words. Go if you like. He will not turn you off in the dark. The path to the light ran along a spine of black rock, with the sea working at both sides, and the tower rose from a knuckle of granite where 3 low buildings huddled with their backs to the weather. There was a lamp burning in one window, a small domestic lamp, not the great light above, and Mara went toward it the way a moth does. Without deciding to, she knocked with a hand she could barely feel. There was a long silence, and then the door opened and a man filled it, broad through the shoulders and gone gray at the temples, with a face weathered into deep, steady lines and eyes the flat, pale color of the horizon. He looked at her, and at the case in her hand, and at the water running off her hem onto his step, and he said nothing at all for what felt to Mara like the turning of a tide. A woman, he thought, and could not for the life of him think what came next. I was told you needed a keeper's helper, Mara said. Her voice came out steadier than she was. I can trim a wick, and I can keep a log, and I can do sums better than any man you'll find on that coast road. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work and a dry corner, and I'll earn both. Cassius Wren looked at her a while longer. The wind came in off the sea and pushed at the back of her, and she did not sway. He noticed that. He noticed, too, that she had said work before she said dry corner, which was the order most people had backwards. It pays $4 the month and you're bored, he said at last, and his voice was low and rusty, a voice not much used. The work is hard, and it is every night, and it does not stop for weather, nor Sunday. I keep the light for the board, and the board is particular. I'll not pretend it's easy. I never met a thing worth doing that was, Mara said. Something moved at the back of his flat, pale eyes, not a smile, but the place a smile would start if he still remembered how. Then come in out of it, he said, and stood aside. And that was the whole of the bargain, struck on a threshold in a failing light. $4 and board, and a door that opened. He was a slow man to speak. She would learn. Slow as the tide is slow, and just as certain to arrive. And she, who had gone unseen through a whole town in a single afternoon, stepped over his step into the smell of wood smoke and lamp oil and something scorched, and felt, for no reason she could have named, that she had come to the end of a very long walk. The something scorched was supper, and the reason it was scorched sat at the plank table with her chin in her hands, a girl of perhaps 7, with Cassius Wren's flat, pale eyes, and none of his stillness, watching Mara come in from the dark like a gull come down the chimney. This was Effie, and Effie did not speak. She had not spoken. Cassius would tell Mara later in the fewest possible words, since her mother went into the sea 3 winters back and did not come out, and the doctor on the mainland had said it might come right with time and might not, and there was nothing to be done but wait and see. So the child kept her own counsel and burned the supper, because her father could not cook and would not learn, and the 2 of them lived out there on the black rock like the last 2 people on earth, eating things burnt and things raw and things that came out of tins, while the great light above them, the one thing Cassius kept faultless, swept its beam across the water every night and told every ship for 30 miles that here was danger. Keep off! Keep off! Mara took off her wet boots and set them by the stove without being asked. She looked at the burnt supper and at the state of the little kitchen, the crusted pots, and the flour gone to weevils, and the general grief of a house where the woman had gone out of it and taken the ordering of things with her, and she rolled up her sleeves. She was tired past the edge of tiredness, but she had learned long ago that work is a kind of rest for a certain sort of mind, and hers was that sort. By the time the child had been coaxed to bed, and Cassius had gone up the winding iron stair to tend the light, Mara had the kitchen scoured, and a pot of oats set to soak for the morning, and the weevily flour thrown to the wind off the rocks. She slept that night on a cot in the storeroom, among coils of rope and drums of oil, and she slept without dreaming, which she had not done in a long while. In the morning she began as she meant to go on. She found the house had a soul under its neglect, good timber and good iron, and a store of things a careful hand could make something of, and she was a careful hand. She scrubbed and she mended, and she took the accounts of the household, such as they were, and set them in a fair copy. And on the 3rd day she did a thing that changed the temperature of that cold house by a degree she could not have measured, but that everyone in it felt. She baked bread. She had brought a little sourdough starter with her, all the way from her father's house, wrapped in cloth and kept alive against her body through the long walk, and she woke it now with the good flour she had bought in Scarrow with her own last coin, and she baked. The smell of it went up the iron stair and out over the rock, and it was Cassius thought coming down from a night's watch, gray-faced and salt-stung, the smell of a place where people lived. He came into the kitchen, and there was warm bread on the board, and the child was standing on a stool with flour on her nose, silent still, but watching Mara's hands the way a person watches something they mean never to forget. He did not thank her. He was not a man who had words for such a thing. But that evening, when Mara set the table for the child and Cassius, and put out her own plate at the end where the help ate, standing to serve, Cassius Wren looked at the arrangement of it, and got up without a word, and moved her plate to the 3rd good place at the table, across from the child, and set a chair there, and sat, and did not look at her while he did it. It was the smallest thing. It was everything. In all the years of her marriage and her widowhood and her service in other people's houses. She sat down in the place he had made, and she found she could not quite speak either, and so the three of them ate their bread in a silence that was for the first time not empty, but full. The trouble, when Mara found it, was in the logbooks, and she found it because she was the kind of person who cannot leave a column of figures unadded. Cassius kept the lights log faithful to the minute, oil consumed and hours burned and weather observed, for the board required it, and he was a man who did what was required. But the household ledger, and the little book where the board's quarterly payments were entered, those he kept the way. A man keeps things he does not understand, which is to say he put the papers in a drawer and shut it. Mara opened the drawer on a wet evening when the light was steady and the child asleep, meaning only to bring order to it, and by the guttering lamp she read what was written there, and then she read it again, and then she sat very still. The keeper of a board light was paid quarterly, and the payment was meant to cover the oil, and the small wages, and the keeper's own living. But for 6 quarters now the payment had come short, and it had come short by exactly the sums entered in a second hand, a fine clerkly hand, under the heading of deductions and assessments. There was a letter folded in with the papers, and she read that too. It was from a company called the Coastal Lights Provisioning Company, which had, the letter explained in warm and regretful language, taken over the supply of the district's lights from the board under a contract of management. Any accumulation of overdrawn oil and unaccounted stores amounting now to $218, and which must, the letter regretted, be settled by the first day of spring, 61 days hence by Mara's count. Mara understood it, the way she understood a chart all at once and in its whole shape. There was no deficiency. There could not be, not from a man who wrote down the oil to the half pint. The Coastal Lights Provisioning Company had inserted itself between the board and its keepers, and it was squeezing them, one lonely rock at a time, inventing arrears against men too proud or too tired or too far from any help to fight a fine clerkly hand. And when the man broke and the light was let to another, the company would take its fee from that man too, and the district's lights would pass one by one into the keeping of whoever the company favored. It was a slow drowning, and Cassius Wren was going under it without a sound, the way he did everything, and he had not told her because he did not have the words, and perhaps because he did not fully believe a person could be robbed by a letter written so kindly. She did not tell him she had read it, not yet. She folded the letter as she had found it and shut the drawer, and she lay awake on her cot among the rope and oil and did sums in the dark. And by morning she had the shape of a plan, and the plan was made of the only weapons she owned, which were numbers and patience and the truth. She began quietly, the way she did everything. She asked Cassius, over the bread and oats, whether he had kept his old logs, the ones from before the company came, and he said he kept every log the board had ever required folded in the sea chest under his bed, going back 11 years to the day he first lit the lamp. She asked, careful as a person crossing thin ice, whether she might copy them fair. For the practice, she said, and to have the household orderly. And he looked at her a moment with those flat, pale eyes and said, in the tone of a man who has decided something, for she had a better head for such things than he would ever have, and he was a slow man, but not so slow he could not see that. It was the longest speech she had heard from him. What she built over the short, dark days of that winter was a case. From 11 years of the board's own logs, she drew the true figure of the oil the light consumed in a year, faithful to the half-pint in Cassius's faithful hand, and she showed it steady as the tide, no more 1 year than the next. She set that true figure beside the figures the company's fine clerkly hand had entered, and the difference stood up off the page like a rock at low water plain for anyone to see who cared to look. The company had charged the light for oil it had never burned, hundreds of gallons of it, over 6 quarters, and called the invented excess a deficiency, and dunned a careful man for the theft. Mara copied it all in her mother's fine hand, the true column and the false, and she wrote it up in a plain letter that made no accusation and needed to make none, and she addressed that letter not to the Coastal Lights Provisioning Company, but to the board itself, to the district superintendent whose name she found on the oldest paper in the chest, a man who had signed Cassius's appointment 11 years before, and she did more than write. On a clear, cold Saturday she walked the 11 miles back to Scarrow with her mother's case in her hand, and she went not to the merchants who had not seen her, but to the harbor, where the men who took ships in and out kept their own accounts, and she asked plainly whether other keepers on that coast had had letters from the Coastal Lights Provisioning Company. She found that they had. She found a keeper's widow and a keeper's brother, and a chandler who supplied 3 lights, and hated the company with a clean, cold hatred, and from each she gathered a figure and a date and a folded letter, and she copied them all fair, and the case that had been one man's grew into a coast's. She was seen in Scarrow that day. She was seen the way a person is seen who is doing something exact and unafraid, and the chandler, a knowing man named Puth, with ink on his fingers, looked at her fair columns and said, she reckoned like a ship's clerk, and asked where a woman had learned it, and she told him at her mother's chair, and he did not laugh. She is a slow one to make trouble, Puth would say of her later, meaning it as the highest praise, slow to make it, and sudden to finish it. The winter deepened, and the plan ripened, and something else ripened alongside it that Mara had not planned at all. The evenings on the Black Rock had a rhythm now. Cassius kept the great light through the dark hours, and in the hour before he climbed the stair, and the hour after he came down, the 3 of them were together in the warm kitchen, and the shape of a family had grown up around the plank table without anyone deciding it should. Effie had begun to follow Mara everywhere, silent, still, but present, and one evening while Mara showed her how the sourdough was fed and kept alive, the child put her small floury hand flat against the crock, as if to feel it breathing, and Mara understood that the child was learning to keep a thing alive, because she had once watched a thing she loved go out of the world and had not been able to hold it. On the clear nights she took the child up onto the rock with her mother's sextant and showed her how to bring a star down to the horizon and hold it there, and how the holding of it told you where you stood in all the wide dark, and the child, who could not or would not speak, learned to point, and Cassius, coming down from his watch, would find them there with their heads together over the brass, and he would stand in the doorway of the light and watch, and think things he had no words for. He was falling, and he knew it, the way he knew weather by a change in the pressure of the air. He watched Mara Coyne move through his house and set it right, watched her feed the child and feed the crock of dough and feed the lamp, watched her bend over her fair columns late into the night, with her mother's book of tables open at her elbow, and he understood that a whole life had walked in out of the rain carrying a small leather case, and that he had very nearly let it walk on by for want of a word. He was a slow man. He had always been a slow man. But he was not, he found, too slow to know what he had. And one evening he came down from the light and found her asleep over her papers with the lamp burned low. And he took his own coat and laid it over her shoulders. She woke under his coat, and she lay still and did not move it. And she looked at the low flame, and she let herself. For the first time in years, want a thing she was not sure she could have. The agent of the Coastal Lights Provisioning Company came out to the Rock on the last clear day of winter, 60 days after the letter, 1 day before the deadline, and he came the way such men come, in a hired boat with a boy to row it, and a soft hat and soft hands and a leather folder of his own. His name was Selleck, and he was a smooth, pleasant, deadly sort of man, the kind who has never once in his life done a hard thing with his hands, and has grown rich telling those who do that they owe him money. He came expecting to find a broken keeper and a rock at the end of the world, and he found instead a scrubbed and orderly house, and a silent child and a woman at a plank table with a stack of fair columns. "You'll be the housekeeper," Selleck said, pleasant as spring, setting his soft hat on Mara's clean table. "Run along, sweetheart, and put the kettle on. I've business with the man of the house." Cassius had come in from the Rock and stood by the door with his cap in his big hands, and Mara saw the old defeat gathering in his shoulders, the shame of a proud man about to be robbed in his own kitchen by a letter and a smile, and she stood up. "The man of the house has asked me to keep his accounts," Mara said, and her voice was quiet and level as the horizon. "So the business is with me. Sit down, Mr. Selleck. I've something to show you before you take your fee." And she laid the true column beside the false, 11 years of faithful log against 6 quarters of fine clerkly invention, and she read it out to him in plain numbers, the gallons of oil this light had never burned, that his company had charged it for $218 conjured out of ink, and then she laid beside it the other letters, the widow's and the brother's and the Chandler Puth's, the whole coast of it, the same false hand, the same conjured arrears, light after light after light. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him of anything. She read him the numbers, and the numbers accused him, and there is no smile in the world that can smile down a column that adds Selleck's pleasant color. Went out of his face by degrees, like a tide going off a rock. "These are copies," he said. "A private woman's copies mean nothing to the company." "They mean nothing to the company," Mara agreed. "That's why I did not send them to the company." She took up the last paper, and it was a letter in the district superintendent's own hand, come back to her 3 days before on the mail boat, and she read Selleck, the part where the superintendent thanked her for her exact accounting, and stated that the board had opened an inquiry into the Coastal Lights Provisioning Company's management of the district's lights, and requested that all keepers hold their arrears unpaid pending its finding. "So you see," Mara said, folding the letter, "there is nothing here for you to collect. And I think, Mr. Selleck, that your hired boat is waiting." He went. There was nothing else for him to do. He gathered his soft hat and his empty folder, and he went down to his boat, and the boy rowed him off the rock into the last light of winter, and he did not once look back. And Mara stood in the doorway. Behind her, Cassius Wren had not moved from the wall. When she turned, he was looking at her, and his flat, pale eyes were not flat at all. "You did that," he said. It was not a question. It was a man discovering the size of a thing. "You sat at my table and you did that, and I never knew a stroke of it." "I did the sums," Mara said. "The sums did the rest." He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "you did it. A whole company, and a board, and a coast of lights, and you did it with paper at my table, and I could not have fought it with my 2 hands if I'd fought a year." He was quiet a while, and the light was going, and out on the water the great lamp above them would want lighting soon. "I'm a slow man," he said finally, which she had heard him say before. "I've been slow my whole life, and slowest of all these 2 winters, sitting in the dark, not knowing I was being robbed, nor knowing what walked in out of the rain. But I know it now. I know what you are." She had waited a long time, one way and another, and she found she could wait a little more. They were married in the spring, on the first mild morning of it, on the rock with the sea gone quiet and gentle and the great light dark above them. Because the day was clear? Cassius asked her the evening before, on the step where she had first knocked, and he made a poor stumbling business of it, being who he was. He said he was not a man of words, and she knew it. And he said the house was better, and the child was better, and he was better with her in it. And he said he did not know how a man asked, for what he had no right to expect, and then he stopped because he had run out. And Mara Coyne, who had walked 11 miles in wet boots to knock on that step, looked at the good-weathered face of him gone anxious in the failing light, and she said, warmly and dry, as she could manage for the lump in her throat, "I was beginning to think I'd have to plot the course and pilot us in myself." And she reached and took his big rough hand in her 2 exact ones, and that was the answer. And he understood it, being slow but never stupid. The Chandler Puth came out for the wedding, and the keeper's widow, and half of Scarrow that had not seen Mara the first time and could not now look away. And Effie stood up between them in a dress Mara had sewn, and when the plain words were said, and the ring, that had been her mother's, was on Mara's hand beside her mother's instruments, the child, who had not spoken in those same 3 winters, said one word, clear as a bell across the quiet rock, and the word was mother, and it was the only vow anyone remembered afterward, and the truest, though it had not been in the service at all. 5 Springs on the rock was not lonely anymore. The Coastal Lights Provisioning Company was gone, its contract broken by the board's inquiry and its fine clerkly hand disgraced, and the district's lights had come back to their keepers, who had every one of them their arrears forgiven and a fair figure entered in a fair column, for the board had asked Mara Wren to review the accounts of the whole coast, and paid her for it, being a board that had learned who could reckon. There were 2 more children now besides Effie, who was 10 and could bring a star down to the horizon and hold it there better than any grown pilot, and who talked, these days, more than her father ever would. The house on the rock had a garden in the lee of it, and glass in every window, and the smell of Mara's bread went up the iron stair every 3rd morning and out over the water, where the fishing boats knew it, and timed their passing to it. On this particular evening, Cassius came down from lighting the great lamp and found his wife on the step with the leather case open on her knees, teaching the youngest to read her mother's book of tables by the last of the light, and he sat down beside her, a slow man, come at last to where he was always going, and looked out at the water. His light was even now warning the ships off of. They had built it slowly, this life, out of bread and columns and stars and a plate, moved to the right side of a table, and it had held. It is a thing the loud and the smiling and the soft-handed never learn, who take what they can reach and move on. The best things are not seized in a season. They are kept the way a light is kept, and a sourdough is kept, and a child's grief is kept, until it can bear the day, faithful to the half-pint, night after night, by someone patient enough to be there when the slow tide finally comes all the way in.